The Ward, written and read by Christopher Halton. Having recently left medical school, where I qualified as a general practitioner, my first practical call to the role came at a busy London hospital. Before I go further, it may help to describe my position and the conditions under which I worked. The pay was unremarkable, but the hospital provided free accommodation, and I was appointed as a house officer. This meant that, on occasion, I could be summoned to assist on the wards whenever required, regardless of whether I was officially on or off duty. Although I was poorly paid and worked long hours, I did receive free meals and laundry services which helped offset the cost. The hours themselves, however, were often tedious. The hospital was somewhat dated, having opened its doors in 1865. And as you might expect, it carried a reputation for being haunted by the many souls who had passed through it. I came from a down-to-earth family that did not believe in such nonsense. Despite the lurid tales shared by fellow doctors and nurses, I was convinced they were merely indulging in mischief at the expense of a young and impressionable mind. Rather than showing fear, I laughed them off. Privately, though, walking through the network of connecting corridors at night unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I attributed this unease to the Victorian decor, the oppressive stillness of the hour, and the occasional echo of a patient gripped by a nightmare in some distant ward. The hospital comprised some 20-odd wards named after birds rather than numbers, a system that for a time proved a nightmare to memorize. As part of my practical training, I was rotated through many of them. There was, however, one ward that was universally disliked, Aviset Ward. It suffered an unusually high number of patient deaths, particularly overnight. This might have been dismissed had it been an intensive care unit, but it was not merely a general ward. It did house a considerable number of older patients, which could logically explain the mortality rate. Yet several other wards shared the same demographic without similar outcomes. One night, I was called from my live-in accommodation to Aviset Ward by the sister in charge, Maud Corbridge. A patient, I was told, was exhibiting hallucinatory behaviour and had become threatening towards her and a young auxiliary nurse. As the ward was only a few minutes away, I dressed quickly and arrived to find both women struggling to restrain an older man. He was shielding himself as though from an invisible presence, his arms raised defensively, his eyes wide as he stared into the ward. The commotion had brought the ward fully to life. The lights were on, and patients sat awake and disgruntled in their beds. I assisted in restraining the man and said calmly, "I'm Dr. Smythe. Please try to settle yourself. You are safe. Tell me what is troubling you." He became less agitated, seemingly calmed by my presence. "Can't you see, doctor?" he said. "It's Nurse Bates. She wants to kill me." "There are only the three of us here," I replied gently, "and none of us is called Bates. Can you tell me where she is now?" "She's gone," he said, his voice trembling. "But she comes and goes, day or night. She says it's my time to go. She tried to suffocate me with a pillow, but I woke up in time." I reassured him that he was safe and administered a sedative. The ward was returned to its night lighting, and as the remaining patients settled back to sleep, I retired to the adjacent staff room. There I sat with a cup of tea and reviewed the man's notes. He was 80 years old and suffered from kidney stones, for which he was scheduled to undergo surgery the following day. He had been admitted 2 days earlier in considerable pain and had been given morphine to manage it. Turning to Sister Corbridge, a woman with more than 20 years of nursing experience, I asked, "Who is this Nurse Bates? Has someone been playing a cruel joke on him?" She scowled. "Are you suggesting, Doctor, that a member of staff or I put such ideas into his head?" "I'm not accusing anyone," I replied diplomatically. "But where would he have learned that name?" She sat down beside me. "There are stories," she said quietly, "going back many years. Nurse Bates worked here in the late 1870s. She murdered patients by placing a pillow over their faces and suffocating them. By the time a ward doctor caught her, more than 30 patients had died. She claimed it was an act of mercy, that God compelled her to do it. And what became of her? I asked. The gallows, she said. She was found guilty and hanged. I leaned forward. Then how would he know about her? The patient told me he met her, Sister Corbridge replied. She gave him her name. He said she was gentle, very comforting, especially when his pain was at its worst. I found all of this impossible to believe and, after ensuring the man was comfortably asleep, returned to my room convinced that he had suffered nothing more than an anxiety attack brought on by the prospect of the following day's operation. 2 days later, after completing an exceptionally grueling shift, I returned to Aviset Ward and encountered Sister Corbridge and her auxiliary. I asked whether the elderly patient had recovered from his surgery without complication. "Didn't they tell you, doctor?" she replied. "The poor man died in his sleep." Her words left a cold, razor-like cut along my spine. But I found nothing in his condition that would suggest such an outcome. Was it a heart attack? "Not at all," she said. "His heart was sound. The post-mortem was carried out the same day and attributed his death to old age alone. Nothing to do with your sedative, in case you're wondering. Some people simply go like that, don't they?" She hesitated. "Still, there is something not quite right about this ward." She led me into the staff room and continued, lowering her voice as she glanced cautiously about. "Nurse Bates truly does seem to linger here, doctor. At various times, day or night, when I visit patients at their bedsides, they sometimes remark that they have already spoken to the other nurse. Of course, that would ordinarily be me. The auxiliary is responsible for changing linen and washing patients, among other duties. As you can see, she looks more like a maid than a nurse. And although modern nursing attire is more practical, the outline and appearance remain broadly similar, which could explain some confusion. Sister Corbridge was a respected member of staff, and I could find no legitimate reason to question her judgment. Yet I still found her account difficult to accept, though I was beginning uneasily to question my own certainty. "Have you ever seen," I asked, "another nurse who shouldn't have been here?" "Nothing I could state with absolute certainty," she replied. "One night, in the shadows cast by the ward's night lighting, I was convinced I saw a figure briefly hovering over a patient's bed. When I looked more closely, there was no one there. I put it down to fatigue and the late hour. But when I checked the patient—" She paused. "She was dead. A heart attack, I was told." By arrangement with Sister Corbridge, she agreed to contact me at my room should any similar incident occur again. The following day, while working on the wards, I resolved to seek out the hospital registrar. If anyone was likely to know the truth behind Nurse Bates, I reasoned, it would be him. The registrar's office was a clerical rather than a medical domain, and the registrar himself was T.G. Iveson. He proved approachable and, as it transpired, something of a historian. He knew a great deal about Nurse Edith Bates, later dubbed the Angel of Death, and recounted that 5 years earlier, when the hospital's earliest records were being transferred to the record office, he had deliberately set aside Bates's employment file to save it from destruction. Included among the papers was a photograph taken during a nurse induction course in 1868. He crossed the room to a green metal filing cabinet, removed a buff-coloured folder, and handed it to me. Inside was Bates's employment history, along with a newspaper cutting from the period. The article detailed how, over the course of 12 months, she had murdered 35 patients, either by suffocation or by tampering with their medication. When questioned by police, she claimed they had been suffering, and that, as an act of mercy, she had ended their lives. The photograph showed a woman in her early 20s. her expression gentle and agreeable. It was difficult to reconcile that face with the crime she had calmly confessed to. When I returned the file, Iveson regarded me thoughtfully. "I gather you've been up on Aviset Ward, haven't you, Doctor?" I confirmed that I had and briefly outlined my involvement. Looking somewhat glum, he said, "I know there's a great deal of talk surrounding Aviset Ward, but there may be entirely logical explanations for these deaths. The ward is very old and, like much of the hospital, would benefit from modernization. Damp has been reported there as elsewhere, and for all we know, a fungal infection could be responsible, causing hallucinations, confusion, even panic. What troubles me," he continued, "is something less easily dismissed. The patients often knew her name. How is that possible?" I agreed. It made no sense whatsoever. And yet, rather than pursue speculation, I resolved to observe. I monitored Aviset Ward closely, determined to see how matters unfolded and whether a rational explanation might still be found. Beyond the testimony of a now deceased patient and an uncertain sighting by a member of staff, I possessed no proof whatsoever, and it was not a subject I could reasonably raise with my colleagues. For several weeks all was quiet. There were no unexplained deaths and no reports of hallucinations. It seemed at last that the matter had resolved itself. Then, on a hot and airless night in July, I was woken by a knock at my door. It was shortly after 11. When I asked who was there, a woman's voice replied, calmly and without urgency, "Doctor, could you report to Aviset Ward?" Before I could ask anything further, there was silence. I opened the door to find the corridor empty. Only the faint cloying odour of embalming fluid lingered in the air, and at the far end of the passage, a fire door swung slowly on its hinge. I dressed and made my way to the ward. On entering, I knew at once that something was wrong. The layout was familiar, yet everything else was not. The beds were heavy iron frames of an older design, the walls freshly kept and adorned with plaques bearing religious scripture. Gas lamps hissed softly where electric lights should have been. The patients lay dressed in plain white smocks. The air was thick with the same sickly sweet smell I had noticed in the corridor. A nurse approached me, her uniform of an earlier era, her manner gentle and composed. "Doctor," she said, smiling, "you look quite unwell. Let me help you." The next thing I knew, I was lying in one of the beds. She stood over me then, serene and attentive. "I am here to help you," she said. "My name is Nurse Bates." I remember the pillow being pressed down over my face. I remember the smell growing stronger, my limbs refusing to respond, my breath failing me. I was unable to cry out. Then there was nothing. I woke in my own bed, my heart racing, to the sound of urgent knocking at my door. It was the auxiliary from Aviset Ward. "Sister asked if you could attend the ward as soon as possible," she said. I told her I would be there shortly. I dressed quickly and made my way to the ward, where I found Sister Corbridge pale and visibly shaken. "Thank God you're here, Doctor," she said. "I saw her, Nurse Bates, as plainly as I see you now. She was walking between the beds carrying a lit candle. She paused at each patient, looking down at them in the candlelight before moving on." Her voice faltered. When she reached the end of the ward, she stopped. She smiled, then she vanished, as though she were absorbed into the flame itself. A moment later, the candle went too. She was trembling, and I guided her into the nurse's room, where the auxiliary had already prepared a fresh pot of tea. As the young woman, Florence Morton, poured, I asked whether she too had seen anything. "No, Doctor," she said, "but earlier I was certain I caught a smell, something sweet and sharp, like embalming fluid." The lingering smell aroused my curiosity. I had little doubt that Nurse Bates had once used it to weaken her victim's resistance, but its repeated association with her presence suggested something more troubling, some connection I could not yet explain. The following day I sought permission to visit the pathology department specimen room. In earlier years, it had been common practice to preserve anatomical abnormalities for study, as well as the brains of convicted murderers, in the hope of identifying the physical seat of criminality. I raised the matter with the head of pathology, Dr. Cordwine Chivers, a respected figure within medical circles. He warmed to the suggestion and proposed that I determine whether Bates's remains had been retained for examination. With his approval, I entered the specimen room in the underground basement and consulted the heavy leather-bound registers. After some searching, I found an entry cataloguing her brain for study. Armed with the reference number, I located it without difficulty, perfectly preserved within a glass-sealed jar. The collection itself was profoundly unsettling. Alongside her were displayed numerous other specimens: malformed infants, severe congenital deformities, and grim curiosities preserved for clinical scrutiny. Whatever its educational purpose, the room struck me as little more than a cabinet of medical trophies. Standing there, I felt a growing conviction, one I resisted yet could not entirely dismiss, that Nurse Bates's influence had not ended with her execution, that some vestige of her remained bound to the hospital, anchored by what had been taken and preserved. If that was so, I reasoned, then the connection could be broken. I removed the jar from its shelf and placed it upon an examination table. The lid resisted at first, seized with age, and when it finally gave way, the familiar cloying vapour escaped into the air. "Leave it alone," a voice said quietly behind me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I did not turn. I did not need to. The smell had grown heavier, almost oppressive. Covering my mouth and nose, I carried the jar to an old Belfast sink and poured its contents down the drain. As the liquid drained, the substance within lost all form, dissolving into nothing before being washed from sight. When I turned back, the room was empty. I replaced the jar with another taken from a hidden shelf and removed the corresponding page from the register. The book closed without comment. I locked the room and returned the key. I later informed an assistant to Dr. Chivers that there was no record of Nurse Bates's remains, and that any such specimen must have been discarded in years past. From that day forward until 1952, when the hospital was finally demolished and replaced on the same site, there were no further reports of Nurse Bates and no unexplained deaths in Aviset Ward. The cycle, it seemed, had ended. The end.